Good afternoon. I'm Leon Davis. It is Saturday, September the 29th at 2 p.m. And you are listening to Altitude Adjustment. I want to thank you for taking the opportunity to join me this afternoon or whatever part of the day that you're listening to this in. This past week, if you know, pardon me, if you've listened to my podcast before, you know I am a big proponent of a national conversation. And the reason I think a national conversation is important is that we have a tendency, or society has been developed partly by inertia and less by actually defining goals of what we expect or want out of our society. And I think by having a national conversation, we can identify some of those goals and we can work towards them as a team, as opposed to one small group having an issue arise, and then there's legislation passed to mitigate that problem, and then that becomes a social norm. So by having a national conversation, we can then discuss why we've chosen to do a particular thing or have a certain particular behavior be supported by society as a whole. This week, there was on display, I say on display because it wasn't really a conversation or part of the national conversation, and maybe it is. Again, I can't specifically say what a national conversation looks like, but this week in the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearing, there was a display of what I call the power dynamic between men and women. The Republicans were pretty battered in all of the articles that I've read and all of the information that I saw about how people perceived the proceedings that happened this week. And that got me to thinking too, just by their behavior, the Republicans' behavior, their pushback against that and how they chose to deal with that, are they really aware of how the things that they're saying is playing to the larger population? One article that I read talked about how for them, this was about winning. And through all of the behavior and all of the things that happened, it was easy to see why someone would think that for them, it was all about behavior. So I'm going to talk about the confirmation coming up, the confirmation hearing coming up, and some of the things that I read. And then the power dynamic between men and women just in general. And of course, I'm not going to be able to cover much in this half hour. And because I don't have I've been trying to get a female co-host to come on to get a woman's perspective on things. And so I'm still going to work towards that. So I may come back and revisit this topic, but right now I'm going to give it a shot for this afternoon. Welcome to Altitude Adjustment. So as I mentioned, there was the hearing this week, and it has been pushed back, or the confirmation vote has been pushed back for another week. But through all of that, there was a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of talk trying to get the Republicans to understand the need to have more investigation into this topic. And one of the principles that I thought was significant this week was Lindsey Graham. Earlier in the week, Lindsey Graham said, regardless of what he heard from Dr. Ford, he pretty much had made up his mind. And so now I have reached a point where I no longer try to point out the hypocrisy of certain people. It's just, but maybe sometimes it's necessary. He is voting to have a man on the Supreme Court for the rest of his life. The things that he will have an opportunity to adjudicate or to preside over will affect millions of lives over an extended period of time, several decades. And for him to say that some new mitigating evidence or accusations have come up, that he has made up his mind that he is staunchly going to support the Kavanaugh nomination based solely on what he knows at this particular point, says that he's taking a win-lose situation. He's taking a win-lose attitude towards this whole nomination. It's because I am not going to hear anything or listen to anything that might cause me to rethink my position. That it does not matter what I hear, does not matter what I see, I am going to vote this way. Then, in the hearing, when each senator was given an opportunity to speak, he made this, and I want to say impassioned because it was a pretty emotional speech. And none of it had to do with really supporting his idea of why. It was to shame or to denigrate or to put down the people who brought up the allegations against the nomination that he was for. So to say that earlier in the week, I am not going to change my mind, and then even after hearing testimony that may or may not need to be looked into, to make this speech about how the other side was treating this and how this was a sham, and all of the statements that he made, to me was a bit hypocritical. If he's saying that they're playing partisan political games when he showed the actual behavior of political partisanship. For whatever reason he had chosen to support Kavanaugh, he was not willing to hear anything that would negatively impact his decision on Brett Kavanaugh. Now, in a post I've made, I felt that Brett Kavanaugh had some mitigating issues before the nomination. In his, there was documents in his file regarding his time in the Bush White House that would bring question to some of his ability to make judgments unbiased, make an unbiased judgment. And so Lindsey Graham, went into this diatribe, and maybe my wording shows my distaste for Lindsey Graham's behavior and his words. So I'm doing the best that I can to not prejudice the someone else's take on Lindsey Graham's behavior, but I find it difficult to find him as objective, as someone that's making his decision based purely on the facts and based purely on what is best for the country as a whole. Now, the reason that I think that that's significant is that the conservative movement has had a lot of success under this current president. They got through the big tax cut that they wanted to get through. So they always talked about taxes. They got rid of a lot of the legislation that they wanted to go away. And abortion rights, and then there was one more. By repealing or working towards repealing the Affordable Care Act, they are putting they're putting the business interests before the public interest. And they're also rolling back some of the gains that women made under that Affordable Care Act. So they were having a big win streak. So this Kavanaugh thing would have been probably the icing on the cake, because it would have gotten them in a position to take down probably their biggest dinosaur. And that is the Roe v. Wade. So there's that big discussion. So for them, I can see where this is a win-lose proposition. This may be probably one of the best opportunities for them to gain that other big win that they would like to have. And looking at their behavior over the week, not wanting to hear from the other witnesses, not wanting to take a step backwards or at least postpone this hearing for any length of time, to me smacked of, we are so close to getting everything that we want. We're going to just barrel through. We're going to push this one over the finish line and be done with it. And so that was my concern with that. Now, from the standpoint of the power dynamic, from getting back to my discussion about the power dynamic, so there was this week, or in this whole instance where they had to interview, or they were going to interview Dr. Ford. They used a woman to do that for them because the optics would look bad. Now, that being unusual, because during the healthcare debate, it was all white men, had no problem with it. Making decisions about pre-existing conditions and women's reproductive rights, they had no problem with it. So they've obviously gained some level of respect for doing it a better way. But that did, as I said, they tried to barrel through and ignore the need to be more reflective of what Dr. Ford had to say. So the issue that I thought was really significant was, so it became a he said, she said. Now, with bringing in the additional witnesses, takes it from being a he said, she said, to actually getting more information and getting context to both of them's side of the story. And they did not do that. Now, they talked about they didn't want to delay the process, They wanted to delay the process. They wanted to get it over with and done, and that it was unfair to Judge Kavanaugh. But they finally caved when one person broke ranks, Jeff Flake. And one of the instances that he encountered earlier this week was women who had been sexually assaulted reaching out to him, and I didn't get a chance to. I didn't take the opportunity to read that article. I had quite a bit of things going on, but it was interesting to see that he took that step saying, I will vote to move this process forward, but I would like to see the FBI investigating. So there's going to be this FBI investigation, and how it's limited in scope, how it turns out I think it's going to be interesting. But with all of that, this week's occurrences shows there's a changing dynamic, or at least there's a temporary changing dynamic. I don't know how long that this will take place. It could be that after this nomination, it could be just like 15 years ago, that we go back to doing the same things that we did before. And there's good reason to believe that there's no lasting change, that it has come down to getting through this moment, and that there are issues larger than the changing dynamic in men and women's behavior. Now, getting away from the nomination for a moment. So I'm looking at, let's say that the change in dynamics has come, or that comes. And one of the things that I have noticed is that so women are saying, keep your hands off my body, and that makes sense. One of the things that I think has been significant is that how we make social norms. So previously there was the Puritan movement, and that has slowly been chipped away. So it was dresses below the ankles, so a woman couldn't show her ankles, and women are saying, that's not good enough. So the dresses get shorter and shorter and shorter. And now we've reached a point where we have celebrities that are, and I know this could trigger more emotional than rational thought, but they are practically nude, walking through the red carpet, and one person tries to out-nude the other person. And while I think the body is absolutely beautiful, and to some degree I can understand both sides of the ledger on this one, on both sides of the issue, how do we, if men aren't allowed to speak up, if men aren't allowed to say what they like about a woman, or about a woman's body, or about a woman's looks, how does that proceed? How does that work for us? So some men aren't going to have any problem whatsoever with a woman being totally nude in public. But some men don't want totally nude. They want something different. So how do they express that? Because if you say something, and we've reached that point where women feel that they don't have to listen to men, then we have a breakdown in communication. So how do you communicate? And one of the things that, now when I say how to communicate, so earlier, so some men were saying that they don't know how to treat a woman in an office because they don't know what they can say and what they can't say. And I think that's bad that they would even say that, because office behavior, if you wouldn't say it to a man, you don't say it to a woman. That's Simple. That's not difficult. If you wouldn't ask your male coworker to lunch, you don't ask your female coworker to lunch. If you take your now I know that there is those men who think a beer lunch at a male establishment is acceptable. You do have to take into account the sensibilities of the person that you're asking to lunch about where you should go for lunch. That's basic. That there's no difficulty there. So to say that you don't know what to say to your female counterparts is disingenuous. It's an attempt to, I think, minimize that you have to behave like a human being. so that I don't get. I don't think it's fair and should not exist. On the other hand, so one of the so I was in a vehicle and I was driving or I wasn't driving, but anyway, I was in a vehicle and I was talking to a young lady and I just asking. There was a time I thought when people dressed because they were trying to catch the attention of certain types of people. So if you dressed more scantily, you were trying to catch someone for a more intimate relationship. And so I asked about that because I don't hear the conversation or chatter about the way someone dresses anymore, and how that reflects on their desires. Now, I realize that it's tricky because in certain situations, such as rape, people want to say that because you dressed this way, that you were sending the message, and we know that that's not true. And so there's a better way to understand that rather than to assume that because someone is more scantily dressed, that it is a sign of poor judgment. Though, how do we then set social standards so that some people are dressed, in a fully head to toe, while other people have absolutely nothing on? Or is that the kind of society that we want? Is that where we want to be in society? Is that how we see society being? So my question on the power dynamic is, how do men and women communicate on a national level to try to understand each other? So a gentleman sees a woman that he finds attractive, and she is dressed comfortably. If his actions seem improper, how do we then make sure that he's not seen as doing something necessarily wrong, and understand and try to learn how to communicate properly? Because I think that to me is what's important, is understanding how that So the man is always, or I can say always, previously the man initiated contact. Maybe he got signals from a lady that he was interested in, and then they go from there. So, so my thought, pardon me. my thought is, um, so that's not written down somewhere. There's no logbook or no do-it-yourself guide that says this is when you can approach safely and when you can't approach safely. I mean, there are some things that, or if you see a ring, you know, you don't initiate any improper behavior. But in the course of just having a good time or just having a nice evening, how do we know when? So, so it's not just the man. I'm sorry. It's just not just the man's interpretation of things. It's there's a communication that is important to that power dynamic. And there are a lot of different ways to interpret messages that are sent. And so the goal is respecting people's space while still creating an environment where everyone prospers, where everyone benefits from, interactions in society. And so I think there, along with the conversation about respecting women, finding equal footing, making sure that everyone is heard and that everyone is respected, that we also understand, try to better our communication between both. And maybe that's down the road. Maybe that's not some conversation that we should have now, because we're still trying to get men. When one out of every five women has been sexually assaulted, that is a humongous problem. It is a humongous problem that needed to be addressed a long time ago. And maybe we need to resolve that problem first before trying to understand the communication between men and women, so that the power dynamic is beneficial to both. So I'm gonna wrap things up. my little friend here, she comes and hangs out with me. I'm gonna wrap it up for today. But I want to come back and try to address this again, because I think, for me, just to understand, but I think it's important because I've, talked to several people and a lot, and because I'm an inquisitive person, I always ask questions, and I was like, well, what do you think of her behavior, or what do you think of his behavior, or what do you think that they were trying to say? And because there's so many different possibilities, it becomes difficult to effectively pin down any single behavior so that you can understand all behavior. And the difficulty is, if we have a communication that is so random, it's going to always be difficult for us to put into place social policies that give everyone the same amount of respect. So we do have to understand the dynamics between how we behave with other people, and I'm talking about public. I have to, but how we handle that dynamic is going to be about how we decide on communications between all people. The difficulty is that we don't all share the same experiences, while we do have experiences that may allow us to sympathize or empathize with one another. And that's probably one of the things that we need to do. But again, that might be down the road. Solving the problem of the aggression towards women and the lack of respect and behavior to them is definitely top of the list. And our occurrence at the current nomination level may be important for cementing the conversation down the road. So I want to thank you very much for this afternoon for taking the opportunity to hang out with me. Now, the video podcast is available on YouTube. You can do a search for Lions Den STL. The audio podcast is available on Stitcher.com, Anchor.fm, the iTunes Store, and the Google Music Play Store. Consider supporting this podcast by visiting anchor.fm/altitude-adjustment2. The internet is powered by your likes, shares, and comments. So please like, share, and comment on this episode where you find it and others, because it matters. As always, be cool, be calm, but above all, be careful. Look out for the other guy, because they may not be looking out for you.